Hello friends, welcome to the second installment of this Nietzsche November series where today we're looking at The Gay Science, one of his most famous books where you see a lot of the core concepts within Nietzschean philosophy, the will to power, eternal recurrence, this whole God is dead thing, and a whole lot more within this book. And as a reminder, this Nietzsche November series is a weekly video where we're discussing a different book from Nietzsche, breaking down the core concepts, themes, talking about it, ideally having a little bit of that dialogue back and forth. So I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments below if you got a chance to read this. I'm going to leave both a copy to this edition, which is where a lot of the quotes and page numbers are going to be coming from. It's from the Walter Kaufman edition. I'm going to link that down below, as well as a PDF version if you don't want to buy the copy. And also, a disclaimer, this is not a perfect reading. I do not come from academia. This isn't going to be the deepest analysis of the gay science. Other YouTube videos, other scholars do a great job at that. This is going to be my own interpretation, and again, an open discussion and dialogue about the book. And lastly, before we get started, I want to shout out my wife who owns an embroidery company and made me this sweatshirt that says Thinking Thoughts. It's a bit of a double entendre that probably a lot of you can relate to, because with all the philosophy we read, it's a bit esoteric. It's a bit imaginative sometimes, and not as always tangible. So we're just thinking thoughts, right, as philosophers. But at the same time, there's that second meaning, that deeper meaning, that the thoughts that we're thinking about, the concepts, the ideas, the philosophers that we read, do require a lot of comprehension and contemplation. They do have a much deeper meaning. So kind of funny. I like it. I think it's kind of very fitting. So if you are interested, I'll leave a link down in the description as well. All right, so starting off with the title, The Gay Science, right? Brings up a lot of question marks, especially today, how we use the term gay and even how we use the term science, and it's not what Nietzsche intended. With that said, it's not an inaccurate translation, it's just a different way of translating it. I believe the Penguin edition has it translated as joyous wisdom or the joyful wisdom. So what does he mean by the gay science? Couple things here. So at the time, obviously gay had nothing to do with sexuality or homosexuality or any of that. Particularly what he meant was kind of this elation, this passion, and this kind of free spirit is, I believe, how he described it in another one of his books. And then with science, he's not really referring too much of the natural sciences as we describe it or think of it. So really what the title is kind of alluding to is this transition in history, which ties to some of the themes of God is Dead, that we're finally transitioning to a science where we feel like we can come to truth. We can find out truth. And of course, he talks about this in the book, that this idea of certainty and truth through science is a bit of an illusion. And it's an illusion because people at the time were overstating or had too much confidence in the ability of science. They really believed that science was going to lead us, and it was on the way to lead us towards an objective morality, an objective way to tell us how to live our lives and behavior and the purpose and meaning of one's life. And obviously it hasn't proven that. And even at the time in Russia, there was a nihilistic movement that had that same idea, that through rationalism, through reason, through science, we can get to like the truth of things. We can get to the, exact way to live our lives or exact way to do things. And obviously that tends to not be the case. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing about this book before we get into the nitty gritty is this is where a lot of Nietzsche's really famous themes and ideas originate from. We see passages that allude to the will to power and explicitly say the will to power. We see the whole concept of God is dead, which leads to a whole host of books basically where on the genealogy of morals and beyond and good and evil, which are the next two videos in the series, you see all of his attacks on morality, Judeo-Christian values, and the perspective of Judeo-Christian values on morality, this divinity, how we basically define our morals and guilt and conscience, sin, redemption, salvation, all of this from religion. And so you see all that get attacked and criticized here, and a lot of discussions on morality overall that we'll dig into. And you also see inklings of eternal recurrence, which is his idea of essentially that everything that has happened will always happen the exact same way. He even describes it, and I think this is an easy way to think of it, as an hourglass that's just continuously getting flipped over and over, and that life is this kind of eternal reoccurrence. So we'll dig more into that in a moment. Another interesting thing that I didn't realize, he references him in one of these aphorisms, but particularly in the introduction, I didn't realize Ralph Waldo Emerson had such an influence on Nietzsche, and that Nietzsche actually really loved his writing and was fascinated by him. So that I thought that was quite interesting as well, that I didn't know before. And the last thing is, again, the structure of this book, because I was talking to my wife about it, and she was like, "Oh, what's it about?" And I was like, "Well, it's not like about one particular thing." So that's something to keep in mind as well when you pick this up, is it's not all about morality. It's not all, the whole book isn't, God is dead. The whole book isn't will to power. It's a whole conglomeration of different ideas, topics, societal criticisms, looks at culture, music, his changing views on Richard Wagner and Schopenhauer. There's a whole lot of stuff. It's broken into 5 different books and 383 different aphorisms, poems, short essays, paragraphs, whatever you want to call them. But it's a very enjoyable book. I feel like I blew through it and enjoyed every second of it. It might be my favorite Nietzsche book. But with all that said, let's start digging into some of the key sections that stood out to me. I'm not going to go through them all, but there's a bunch that I tabbed that were very important and I think worth discussing to a greater extent. So let's start digging into this. All right, first off, we got to talk about God is dead. So I'm going to connect a couple different sections because they all kind of connect, but they're split up a little bit. So we're going to start off with section 108. And because it's quite short, I'm just going to read the whole thing and we can discuss it after. So he says, after Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead. But given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. Okay, so quite short, but we get that first, boom, God is dead. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. And what he means by God is dead is essentially that our cultural ties to religion is done. That the proverbial God is dead, and that we have basically secularized society and in a way that brings us a lot of freedom, which we'll get to in one of the sections. It brings us a lot of elation because we are not under the constraints of sin. We're not under the constraints of this divine purpose. We have a lot more freedom in that way, and we aren't under the constraints of the church. All of that. However, if there's no divine morality, then morality overall, good and evil, right and wrong, all of that, gets a little hazy, gets a little ambiguous, it gets a bit more subjective, because now we don't look to God as defining what's right or wrong. We have to look to man. And now it goes to government. Government gets to tell you what's morally righteous and what's immoral. So there's a whole cascade of consequences that come out of this realization that Nietzsche has that obviously religion didn't fully die in his time, so to speak, and obviously today religion still reigns extremely strong. However, you do see a lot more atheists, a lot more agnostics, you see a lot more secularized governments and societies. And I think because of that, we see a lot more existential crisis. But let's pause on that for now. So we have that God is dead, which is essentially society is becoming more secularized. The proverbial control that religion has over society is dead, if not declining. There's a degradation going on there. But here's the key part. And I heard a discussion on this on a podcast like a year ago. So if I could remember, I'll put it in the description. If not, remind me later. It was a great discussion, and it was referencing the section because it talks about his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave. Now, what that kind of alludes to, and with the cave overall, we see this allusion towards likely Plato's allegory of the cave, where a lot of our existence and things we hold to be true and valuable and all, et cetera, are just shadows on a cave wall. They're not the true reality, so to speak. But his cave, or his shadow is still shown for centuries in the cave. And later he says, it will still be on the cave for thousands of years in which his shadow will still be shown, and we have to vanquish his shadow. Now, what I get from this is that despite religion being declining, let's say, or science has tried to fulfill that role and push God to the side, we still have this almost biological or primal instinct to grasp for ideologies or grasp for something to firmly believe in. So although God has died, so to speak, let's say Christianity has gotten cast to the side, the shadow of ideological conviction, the shadow of us wanting to fixate ourselves to a particular cause, a particular group, a particular belief system is still there. So despite God being cast away, dead, whatever you want to, metaphorically use, the shadow of the Buddha in this instance is still on the cave shadows for thousands. We still have to vanquish the shadow. So we still have to vanquish this innate desire and attachment that we have as humans towards some ideology, is how I interpret that. Now, that leads us to the most famous section in the book. The section has, I guess, led to a bunch of Christian movies, like the whole God is Dead series. But it's the madman in the marketplace scene. This is where he really punches home the concept of God is dead. But I think the ending is quite fascinating if you get to it. So to reference a couple sections in here, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's quite big, but section 125, we hear, this madman comes in the marketplace. He's got a lantern. I think it's in the morning, too. It's morning hours. It's bright morning hours. So despite the sun being out, he's coming in with the lantern. So that's already quite confusing. And there's something to think about there. And he says, I seek God, I seek God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then. That's a key point, is that people that are in the marketplace already do not believe in God, which is why later on they laugh at him and they kind of mock him, which is, again, an illusion that at this time, us rationalists, right, us empiricists already have gotten rid of those myths and those, ideas of religion or of any God or greater power, right? Everyone's turning towards the natural sciences after this Enlightenment era, this age of enlightenment. So there's already this idea that culture has already turned its back on religion. They're mocking the madman, and they tell him, I will tell you, we have killed him. You and I, all of us are his murderers. So again, you see this concept of, okay, God is dead, and specifically, we have killed him. And how have we killed him? Well, by creating science and by leaning on science. And it's not something that was forced upon us. It is kind of internally. Like the human race itself kind of washed away this emphasis and this belief system itself. So we are his murderers, essentially. And here's where it gets interesting, which is what I was talking about earlier, where if God is proverbially dead, if religion, let's say, we got rid of it. You hear people say it all the time. If we just didn't have religion, we'd have peace or something like that. Put that to the side for a minute, but you hear that, right? Well, there's a lot of consequences if you get rid of religion, if you get rid of people's, trust in divine morality and purpose, community, all of that. And I like these sections right here where he says, what were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Is there still up and down? Or he says, is there still any up or down? So if you think of like religion as tethering us to this existence, to this reality, it kind of just keeps us in check. It gives us form, it gives us structure. Versus if we cut that, right? If we cut the earth and we, I guess, eliminated the gravitational pull of the earth to the sun, or however scientifically we stay in that, orbit, now we're just floating aimlessly in the universe. We have no tethering, again, to a singular purpose, a singular morality, a singular way of doing things, a behavior. We don't have a singular force to look to. And so I love that metaphor of the sun as being like our North Star, what we kind of circle around and revolve around. And for a while, that was society and existence and humanity was centered around religion. It was centered around their God, whichever God it was, depending on the society, the tribe, whatever. But once you cut that string, and you let the earth, the tennis ball, whatever you want to call it, away from the paddle, it can go anywhere. And so, we lose up and down. We lose, where are we going? Is there any direction? Is there any path? That's what he's getting at. Later on down, he says, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Again, hitting that home that religion is on this decline, or it is dead in this instance because people already aren't believing. Later down, he goes, what festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? A little bit further, must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? And what I get out of this is because we've stripped away religion, now we have to find some new purpose. And a lot of, what we shift towards, if we look at culture over the years, over the centuries, is it is a shift towards individuality. It's a shift towards me, 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 me. It's a shift towards luxuries and pleasures. And we look to celebrities as gods, right? Must we ourselves not become gods? We look to these celebrities and kings as, our North Star, our, who we look up to, who gets to tell us what to do. Is, it's the president, it's the king, it's the, prime minister, whatever it is. So, we see a lot of that going on too. Flipping over the page, we get to, here's the key section that I thought is really fascinating. I haven't sat and contemplated too much on it to have a firm opinion, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this section particularly. He says, the madman then turns around and he's about to head out, and he goes, I have come too early. My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way. So we get this madman. He comes into the scene, right? And they're like, this guy's crazy. We don't believe in God. This guy's nuts. God's been dead, whatever. And then he goes, instead of going, oh, shoot, they don't believe, he goes, I've just come too early. That's the problem. I've come too early. So what does it mean for him to come too early? Well, it's kind of an idea tying back to that Buddha in the cave scene, where is Nietzsche suggesting that there's a resurgence of religion down the line? Is he seeing that there's this kind of degradation of religion, but that's going to lead us to like some calamitous, collapse of society that leads us back into religion? Is there kind of this like inverted bell curve going on? Or is this alluding towards our commitment to another ideology, or another kind of greater societal purpose or something like that he's come too early, that he's not there? I think there's some kind of idea that Nietzsche believes there's going to be a resurgence or return to God, to religion. For what reason? I don't think he particularly explains or expands, but anyway, I thought that was very fascinating, right? Like that he goes, oh, I've just come too early. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments below. I'll probably say that a million times in this video, but let me know what you think down there. One of the last sections, looking at my notes, we see 343. Let me get over here. But again, he kind of just, he chirps at the whole God is dead thing, then comes back to it later on. Yes. So this is the section where he kind of talks about some of these consequences a little bit. So again, he says, the greatest recent event that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable. So again, putting forth with the science we have now, which this is again 1880s, with the science they have now, they're Darwin getting published. I think it's called The Origin of. I'm gonna miss on it, but Darwin's book basically promoting this concept of evolution comes out, and it's becoming unbelievable to believe in God at this point. And so he states that God is dead. We've been through that. And he says what this event really means and how much must collapse now that this faith has been undermined because it was built upon this faith. Later on, propped up by it, grown into it. For example, the whole of our European morality. So again, I wrote in here, consequences of religion collapse. You got morality getting thrown out the window. Right now, we got to rethink our whole moral system. What's right, what's wrong, what's righteous, moral, sin. We got to rethink this whole thing if we don't have God. Then we also got to think about our meaning. Why do we do what do we do? If it's not to get to heaven, if it's not to, act a certain way, we got to rethink this, right? Like the whole concept of it is easier for a poor man to get to heaven, or it is easier to fit a camel through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. So if that's not true, then maybe luxuries aren't so bad. Maybe, I don't have to do this or that, the other. So we get this whole behavioral aspect going on, and just structure overall. Again, a lot of people are fixated, even today, for better or for worse, to church and to community. And I think there's a lot of benefits to that. I've gotten into that in another video. But without religion, without God, without this central divine force that we look to, again, our structure, how we shape our communities, how we, operate, philanthropy, all these different things get thrown out the window or have to get reevaluated, essentially. And then at the end of this, he says, all the daring of the lover of knowledge is permitted again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Perhaps there has never yet been such an open sea. So what he's getting at is, for philosophers, for free spirits, for atheists, this is the best thing ever. This is like finally the shackles of religion, and especially at this time, it was easier, but religion and church still had a stronghold on what you were allowed to say and do and what was accepted in society. Well, now that this God is so-called dead and that religion is on the decline, there's a lot more freedom for science to explore things, a lot more freedom for writers like Nietzsche to discuss these without getting called a heretic and threatening their life, like we see with a lot of writers and scientists through history. Galileo comes to mind. I mean, even Hobbes had to kind of walk on thin ice in Leviathan when talking about God. So that it's just an interesting point to take, that he was kind of elated by it. Hence, again, the gay science is, I'm sure, a connection there. And then the last section I'd like to reference in this whole God is dead morality type section is 124, where it's very beautifully written. I feel like there's a lot you could discuss here, but I'll just point out a few sections. So again, he says that we have burned our bridges behind us. Indeed, we have gone further and destroyed the land behind us. So there's this idea that, and how he describes it here is this metaphor of this bird, okay? And we're trapped on this land in this cage, but now that God is dead, now that we've gotten rid of religion, we've kind of flown out of the cage. We've destroyed the land, we've destroyed our foundation of how we used to operate as human beings, and we've left it. The only problem is we've left it unrepairable. Like, we can no longer go back to the land. So we have this open sea, and we have this large, vast open space to explore now. But as he alludes here later, the bird becomes homesick for the land as if it had offered more freedom, and there is no longer any land. So I just think it's really beautiful. He says, "Oh, the poor bird that felt free and now strikes the walls of this cage." So again, a beautiful section. It is just this awareness of Nietzsche that despite he's excited and feels like there's a ton of freedom and opportunity moving beyond religion, there's a lot of consequences, not just for himself, but for society overall. So we see a lot of this shifting and changing in his time. But with all that said, let's move on to some other key sections within the book. I got section 329 pulled up, and this is where he talks a lot about leisure, idleness, work, and I think it's super relevant today. When I was reading this, I was like, man, not only was Nietzsche like ahead of his time, but some problems and issues we think of as, oh, that occurred in the 1800s, or that was in the 20s, or something like that, we still see them play out today. So let me just get to the actual text here. So I'm going to read off this quote real quick. He says, "Even now one is ashamed of resting, and prolonged reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in one's hand, even as one eats one's midday meal while reading the latest news of the stock market. One lives as if one's always, quote, might miss out on something. Quote, rather do anything than nothing." Man, is this true today? I mean, our whole society is focused on productivity. Gotta be productive. Gotta be multitasking. Gotta be doing something. Can't sit in silence. Can't just, there's gotta be background noise, background music. Gotta be doing something. Can't just be sitting on your butt. You're wasting time. And certainly people waste time today. But man, does this reign true. And the idea of the us having a bad conscience when we're not working, I mean, I feel that so much. And if any of you are a bit of a workaholic as well, I'm sure you do too. Even sometimes when I'm reading, I'm like, man, I feel guilty. I'm sitting here, reading this, information or entertainment, whatever you want to call it. I could be working. I could be, running, doing some errands, doing something productive, right? And it's just a silly thing to think about, that you have to constantly work, rather do anything than nothing. And the problem is we lose leisure. We lose leisure, and the value of leisure, I'll get to in a moment, but he says, quote here, "Living in a constant chase after gain compels people to expend their spirit to the point of exhaustion and continual pretense and overreaching and anticipating others. Virtue has come to consist of doing something in less time than someone else." Nothing really needs to be added there. I mean, I think if you read that section, you're like, yep, sounds about right. Trying to do more work and less time, more than someone else, gain, all about the money, right? And then at the bottom, love this. He says, quote, "The desire for joy already calls itself a need to recuperate." Man, I love this guy. It's so on point. I mean, think about it. We relax. We take a work break. We go on vacation, right? We come home from a long day to sit in a recliner, put on Wheel of Fortune or some sitcom, just because we're taking the edge off. We need to recuperate after work. Just to do what, right? To go in the next morning and work again and drain our lives away. Man, it's just so accurate. On the backside, he says people can no longer give in to the desire for he says, vita contemplativa. I'm going to pronounce it wrong. It's a life of contemplation is what he's getting at, without self-contempt and a bad conscience. So we can't just sit in idleness and think about philosophical concepts or our life or our meaning or what it brings us joy. We can't sit and contemplate, ruminate, without feeling guilty, like we're wasting time. Oh, we're not doing anything useful, right? We're not being productive or pragmatic. So I just love that section. I was like, man, I mean, you could plop that into some self-help book, right? Modern day, although maybe self-help books are part of the problem. But you could plop that into any book today and people would be like, yep, that is accurate today, just as much, if not more, than it was back in his day. Next section I want to discuss is 335, and in this section we start to see his critiques on morality. So he kicks it off. First sentence here in this section: how many people know how to observe something? Of the few who do, how many observe themselves? So how many people know themselves? I mean, that's the whole thing, and he references here, know thyself. It goes back to Delphi and the ancient Greeks and Socrates and all of that, right? Know thyself. And what he's getting at eventually is critiquing this idea that we judge, oh, this is right, this is wrong, this is immoral, this is, we say, oh, how do I know that, doing so-and-so thing or saying whatever is wrong? Well, my conscience tells me. Well, what Nietzsche points out is your conscience is primarily formed from your own prehistory of experiences and instincts and likes and dislikes. And so we're kind of, again, indoctrinated in a way to believe certain things. Now, again, you might still rationally think through and say, to steal is bad, all fine and good. But there are certainly a number of things where we're raised a certain way to believe something that's not actually true. For example, in early days of America, right, plenty of people were raised from racist families, and they believed that black people or any kind of minority were inferior, that they just didn't have intellectual capabilities. Obviously, incredibly wrong, ignorant, and obviously racist. But they were raised that way. They didn't know any different. They didn't question it. And that's what he gets to. Is he says, you have never thought much about yourself and simply have accepted blindly that what you have been told ever since your childhood was right. Particularly, again, now I don't want to get too tough on that tangent example I just used, but specifically on morality. That this is right, this is wrong, you should be guilty or feel guilt if you do a certain act. A lot of that is coming from being raised in a religious family or being raised in a government or society that has those kind of Judeo-Christian values or perspectives. And he says, the firmness of your moral judgment could be evidence of your personal abjectness of impersonality. Your moral strength might have its source in your stubbornness or in your inability to emphasize new ideas. And he later goes on and talks about, within this section, our need to essentially come up with our own unique values. As he says here, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws or create themselves. So this whole section is, first off, we got to know ourselves. And why do we need to know ourselves? Well, because we've kind of been indoctrinated with these beliefs that particularly pertain to morality and judgment and behavior. And a lot of this, we view any heresy against these judgments. We view ourselves deviating from these accepted perspectives, any deviation as wrong, so that keeps us in this stubborn box. We can never break out of it. When in reality, we need to assess these things and have this, which he gets into other books, is reevaluation of all values. Again, if religion is declining, if you secularize yourself, if you believe that God is quote unquote dead, then you need to have this ability to create your own values, values that affirm your life, values that help advocate for your own existence rather than ones that restrict your own pleasure, happiness, and striving, anything that demands asceticism of you. Moving on to 338, we see a concept that he builds off more in the next two books, but his gripe with pity. Well, why does pity really grind Nietzsche's gears? And he expresses it in a very fascinating way. It was one sentence that really struck me. I was like, man, this is good. And down here in the lower section of 338, he says, the path to one's own heaven always leads through the voluptuousness of one's own hell. His gripe with pity is that someone not allowing you to suffer, someone not allowing you to kind of sit and experience pain, experience negative emotion, someone trying to strip that away from you, is one, they're expressing a little bit of that superiority complex. It can be a little condescending, but two, they're taking away your opportunity to overcome. If you never have obstacles, you never have pain, you never have something to overcome, you do not have that opportunity for growth. You do not have that opportunity to kind of inflict your own power and, again, ability to overcome. And that can be kind of demeaning, you know? And he says here, it's basically sourced, and the religion of pity, he quotes and calls the religion of comfortableness. So again, you see a little bit of this today where you can see, you know, helicopter parents, right? They never let their kids actually face adversity, and because of that, they get to the real world and they're not prepared. They're anxious and uncomfortable constantly because they weren't faced with that pushback and that discomfort earlier on in their life. So there is that need for discomfort to have growth. Again, there's a term in cooking, agrodolce, that I heard someone say, you know, sweet and sour. You need both to have like a good meal, right? You need sweet in relation to the sour, and everything can't be too sweet, everything can't be too sour. And here's the quote that I just love. He says, how little you know of human happiness, you comfortable and benevolent people, for happiness and unhappiness are sisters, and even twins that either grow up together or, as in your case, remain small together. Man, I love that. I love thinking about happiness and unhappiness as sisters, as twins, because it's so true. We cannot have happiness without unhappiness. There has to be this undulation of emotion, of happiness. We can't always be up. We can't, you know, and we can't always be down either, you know. Everything is relative. Everything has to be in this like yin-yang dynamic relationship. And it is just fascinating metaphysically in life, you know, there always is like a yes, no, there's like this dichotomy, right? It's happy and sad, and you know, yin and yang, black and white. There's like this thing going on. They're all relative to each other, right? I don't want to ramble too long on that, but I love that section. And then he ends it with saying to share, that preachers of pity to share not suffering but joy. So again, that's another one of his gripes with pity is like you're sharing your suffering with someone else if you allow them to essentially like express pity. Like just you'd rather just share joy. You don't need to like share in the suffering with somebody else per se. So moves us on to eternal reoccurrence, which I wouldn't say he explains that much. Maybe I'm misreading. I don't think he really explains it in this book that vividly, but he brings it up in a few sections. He brings it up in 109, 285, and 341. And particularly in 341 is where I began this video and read that out. Here it is. It's the quote that he says, the eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. And a little bit earlier in that section, he says, the life as you live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Not going to expand on it too much, but this concept of eternal recurrence, I find it quite fascinating. It's basically like this idea of like fate and that things always happen, and not only always happen in the way that they have to, but they happen in an innumerable amount of times. I almost think of it as like time as being a circle. So everything has happened, and it's going to always happen in the same way. You're always going to watch this video at the exact same time in your life in the exact same way, and I'm going to be making it the exact same way in an innumerable amount of times. So it's interesting. It's like, does that bring you solace that things will always happen? It won't just purely end. Or does it bring you fright because it's always going to happen the exact same way and there's no like alteration of it? I don't know. But that's eternal reoccurrence. And then a big section, 349, we see a very important section because this is where he brings up the will to power. And in this section, it's pretty short, it's like 2 paragraphs, is he brings up how Darwin and a lot of, again, natural scientists of the time are, and even Spinoza, believes that life is all about this kind of it's a will to survive, it's a will to live, it's a struggle for existence, it's that survival instinct, right? Nietzsche disagrees. Nietzsche believes that rather than will to live, it should be will to power. He explains this in this quote: the great and small struggle always revolves around superiority, around growth and expansion, around power, in accordance with the will to power, which is the will of life. Particularly what he has a gripe with is that will to live is kind of from the perspective of the weak. They're just striving to like exist versus, and this kind of ties to his slave morality, mass morality, which we'll get to in his other books. But again, he views life to its fullest. What we should aspire towards is a will to power, a will to abundance, a will to growth, to expansion, to always striving. He doesn't side with Schopenhauer in this idea of like denying the will and receding and basically resigning the will and becoming more of an ascetic or like a monastic type of life, right? I'm rambling too long. Essentially, he views life as pursuing superiority, pursuing power, hence the will to power. So that's again 349, great section, especially because it's a key concept and one of his most famous topics he talks about. And then moving on to 356, we see again an interesting section that explores work again. So touching on that section, let's see, what was it earlier I pointed out? 329 was when he was talking about leisure. This is again building off that idea of work. He says almost all male Europeans to adopt a particular role, their so-called occupation. So again, we grow up in modern day, right? We graduate, we get to college. Maybe we graduate college, university, whatever it is for you. But then you get your job, right? You kind of adopt this role in society and in culture, and particularly you adopt it as your identity. I am, an electrician. I am a chemist. I am an engineer. I am a teacher. I am whatever. And we kind of forget too how one, he says that this role becomes our character, which is what I'm trying to explain, is that it becomes our identity, who we are. We fixate too much on that. We attach ourselves, our whole persona, our whole self to this action, to this occupation. But also he kind of points out we have this illusion of choice. Like we imagine that we chose to be a firefighter, we chose to be whatever, when often this is from accident. This is from chance. This is from our circumstances and our environment. For example, if you were raised in a family that was always, the father always went to the military. Your dad was in the military. Your grandfather was in the military. Likely you're going to be in the military. And that wasn't probably because you chose it. It's probably because you had that admiration for your parents or whatever occupation they had. And they probably influenced you, or your circumstances influenced you, or maybe they restricted what your options were. Maybe you only had a few options to choose from because of whatever is going on in your life. So we kind of have this bit of an illusion of choice. However, he points out that at this time, again, you got to think in the 1880s, the faith of the Americans today, he references, they're changing the sentiment in Europe. The Americans are influencing Europe and showing that people can do just about everything and can manage almost every role. He goes down on the page, he says that they start to be these like actors. They can kind of do anything, right? The problem is though, because they're acting like actors, they become actors. And he describes this down below, and this is a disadvantage, particularly for the quote unquote, the great architects. And he goes down, he says that who would still dare to undertake projects that would require thousands of years for their completion? Further down, the faith that man has value and meaning only insofar as he is a stone in a great edifice. So what he's getting at here is that once people are becoming actors, once people are kind of electing to choose to be whatever in society, and again, they're still adopting this as their character, as their identity, they start to become individuals, very individualistic, okay? And because of that, they stop caring about society. They stop looking to be part of that edifice, to be a stone in that edifice. So they stop trying to really look at themselves as how am I contributing to humanity? They look at how am I contributing to myself. So he references that all of us are no longer material for society, is what he says. And then later down, I love this. He critiques socialists and he says, "Free society? Question mark. Free society? Yes, yes. But surely you know, gentlemen, what is required for building that? Wood and iron, the well-known wood and iron, and it must not even be wooden." Classical phrase that Schopenhauer, I think, used as well. This idea of wood and iron, obviously, it's contradictory, and that's what he's getting at. There's no such thing as a free society. Free and society are contradictory because to exist in a society, you have to give up some of your freedoms. So with all that said, I love that section. I think it's quite illuminating on society, both from the individual versus community aspect, and from the idea of thinking of occupation or illusion of choice, all of that. Now, to wrap up this video, I want to point out a few quotes that I thought were very fascinating. I'll explain a little bit of why, and so let me rattle those off, and then we'll wrap up this discussion here. His first quote is on page 108, section 41. He says, "A thinker sees his own actions as experiments and questions, as attempts to find out something. Success and failure are for him answers above all." Beautiful. It's really like the idea of real thinkers don't just look at, oh, did it work, did it not work, did things go my way or not. They look at things, they look at failed hypotheses as, okay, well, what can I learn from that? So it's a very optimistic and productive way of, I think, going about life. On page 203, section 179, he says, "Thoughts are the shadows of our feelings, always darker, emptier, and simpler." Man, and what he's getting at there is that our thoughts are kind of constrained by language, and they're never like the thing itself. Our thoughts are essentially shadows. So like if I'm feeling an emotion, let's say I'm feeling elated, I'm feeling happy. Well, happy and elated, they're just attempts at describing that feeling, but they're not like the thing in and of itself. They're just shadows, so to speak. So I like that section. I think it's well put. Section 232 on page 212. He says, "Either we have no dreams or our dreams are interesting. We should learn to arrange our waking life the same way. Nothing or interesting." Man, that section is beautiful. I told my wife that section to write it to her just because we see that today. Like there's similar quotes, right? Like, oh, either be all in or not at all. If you're not passionate about something, don't do it, right? And that's a great way of putting it. And it's also very true. Like, we don't remember boring dreams. We remember the dreams where we're like flying or, we're with someone we know or so the wackiest thing is happening, right? So, let's try and live life like that. Let's live interesting. Let's live intentional and passionate and urgently. Or, nothing at all. Spend time doing something idle. Be all in or not, right? Section 248, page 215, he says, "What good is a book that does not even carry us beyond all books?" Love that too, because it makes me think, like a book shouldn't just be something that you finish and you're like, oh, that's pretty good, interesting ideas. It should be something that, quote unquote, carries us beyond all books. It should be something that, a really good book, a book that at least most writers strive, right, for, is something that is going to be something that changes your view on life. It changes your perspective, how you do things, and I think Nietzsche does that for me, and it probably does it for you too. So, yeah, without rambling too long on that, I like that. I like that quote. And the last one, section 305, page 245. "For one must be able to lose oneself occasionally if one wants to learn something from things different from oneself." Perfect. Like we can't be the same person we are today and become a better version of us later. Like you have to evolve. You have to let things go. You have to be able to be malleable as a self, and that goes with your beliefs and opinions too. So, with all that said, let me know your comments down below. What sections did I miss? What sections did you think were very riveting? List them down below. Feel free to expand. Disagree with me on a section? Let me know. We talked about a lot of sections here, and again, because this book isn't like one consistent talking point, I think there's a lot for anyone to gain from this book. So really enjoyed it. Quite a short read. Again, I'm going to link a copy to buy down below, as well as a PDF. Yeah, I hope you guys are enjoying this series so far. And obviously, I'm trying to stay on my reading schedule so I can get another video out for you guys. The next one is going to be on the genealogy of morals. So we're going to get all into morality, Nietzsche's perspective on it. Unfortunately, again, he's going to attack some Christian values or just religious values overall. But looking forward to that video. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts. I think this video is long enough at this point. Drop me a like, subscribe for more content like this. Stick along for the series, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.